Empty eggshells, remember those? Prices through the roof. It felt like the bird flu was never going to end last year. Well, get ready, folks, because this time it's a whole new level of weird.
You got that right. This isn't your everyday bird flu. This strain, this one is highly pathogenic, meaning it can really do some damage. And get this, it's jumped species. From poultry to cows, even humans. You guys sent us a Reddit thread. Everyone's pretty anxious about it. And a Scientific American article, too. That one lays out all this sciencey stuff. So we're going to help break it all down for you.
Jumping species. Okay, yeah, that's enough to make anyone a little nervous. So what are we dealing with here exactly?
We're talking H5N1. It's a really nasty version of bird flu. Now, bird flu itself, that's not new. But the way this strain's acting, that's what's got everyone worried. Early this year, dairy farmers, especially in Texas, they started seeing their cows getting sick. Milk production just plummeted. Researchers found out it was H5N1, and that's when the alarm bell started ringing.
So it's not just a couple sick cows here and there. Just how widespread is this thing?
It spread to herds in 16 states. And that's probably just what we know about. A lot of farmers didn't want to test their cows. They were afraid of what would happen if the tests came back positive. You know, losing their whole herd, that's their livelihood. It's a tough spot to be in.
I can see why they wouldn't want to test, but wouldn't that just make it harder to stop it from spreading?
Yeah.
Seems kind of counterproductive, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right. It created this blind spot, made it super hard to track the virus, to figure out exactly how it was moving between the cows. Some folks thought it was wild birds, but it looks like it was spreading from cow to cow, maybe through milking equipment that wasn't cleaned properly. All that missing information, it really slowed down the response.
Okay, so we got a super contagious virus, farmers who are scared, and a lot of unknowns. Sounds like a nightmare for the USDA. Did they step up?
Well, their response, let's just say it wasn't exactly speedy. It took them forever to get nationwide milk testing going. Like, imagine the fire alarms blaring, but the fire department takes months to show up. And then how they talk to farmers and the public, well, let's just say there was room for improvement.
So not a great response. Was it just like government being slow, or was there something else going on? That Reddit thread was full of people saying it was all about industry pressure, like the big companies were pushing the government to do what they wanted. Any truth to that?
It's definitely something a lot of experts are talking about. Farmers were freaking out about losing their farms, and that pressure, it probably went all the way up to the USDA. Maybe that's why they waited so long to do things like mandatory testing, or to really figure out what was going on. Think about it. The economy would take a huge hit if they had to kill off entire herds.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Protecting people versus protecting farmers' businesses. Speaking of protecting people, let's talk about the humans in all this. It's not just about sick cows, right? People are getting infected too, aren't they?
Yeah, unfortunately. Over 60 people in the U.S. have caught it, mostly farm workers. And this is where things get even more complicated, ethically, I mean.
The Reddit thread was blowing up about how those farm workers were being treated. What was going on there?
From what we're seeing, a lot of these workers were exposed to this virus without any real protection or even basic information about the risks. Imagine working in these barns. It's hot, cramped, you're killing sick birds, and you don't even have a good mask or gloves. And some workers, when they started getting symptoms like really bad eye infections, they were told not to go to the doctor or get tested. Can you believe that?
Wait, they were told not to get tested. Why would anyone do that? And what about those bird flu vaccines everyone's talking about? Why didn't they give them to the farm workers? They're the ones right there on the front lines, right?
Yeah, that's a big point of contention. The CDC saying they didn't have enough information to start vaccinating everyone. But a lot of people are pushing back. They're saying protecting those workers should have been the priority. It's a complicated situation, that's for sure.
So we've got potentially sick cows, infected workers, and the government's response, well, not great. But is this really going to be a pandemic, or is that just fear-mongering?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's a valid concern. Historically, this type of bird flu, it kills about 50% of the people who get it. Now, it doesn't seem to be spreading easily between people, not yet at least, but every time someone gets infected, it gives the virus another chance to mutate. It could change just a little in its genetic code, and then suddenly it's super contagious, and then we're in a whole different situation.
Okay, yeah. That's a scary thought, a deadly virus spreading through the food supply. And then who knows where else. You mentioned mutations. Can you explain that a little more? What makes them so dangerous?
Okay, so think of it like this. The virus is constantly making copies of itself. Every now and then, there's a mistake in the copying. It's like a typo, a tiny change in the code. Most of the time, those changes, they don't really do anything. But sometimes a mutation, it can make the virus easier to spread, or it can make it more deadly.
So the more it spreads, the more chances it has to become a real problem for humans. That's not great. What are the chances of that happening?
It's impossible to say for sure, but virologists all over the world, they're watching this thing really closely. They're looking at the virus's genes, trying to see if it's adapting to humans. There was this case in Missouri recently that really shook things up.
Oh, yeah, I saw people talking about that on Reddit. Everyone was losing their minds. What was so different about that case?
Well, in that case, they couldn't rule out human-to-human transmission. Now, that doesn't mean it definitely happened that way, but it means it's possible. And that's enough to worry even the experts.
So we got a lot we don't know, a virus that's changing all the time. And it feels
Uh-huh.
like things could go really bad really fast. This is starting to feel pretty bleak. Is there any good news here?
There is, but we got to change how we're thinking about this. And we got to really address the things that made this outbreak happen in the first place. And that's what we're going to dive into next.
Yeah, it's easy to get sucked into all the what ifs and the worst case scenarios. But honestly, we're not totally helpless here. There are things we can do, real actions that can reduce the risks and maybe, just maybe, steer us away from the really bad stuff.
Okay, I'm listening. Lay it on me. What kind of solutions are we talking about here? That Scientific American article had a few ideas, but I gotta be honest, after all that mutation and pandemic talk, all I can think about is building an underground bunker.
I get it, the anxiety is real, but let's focus on what we can control. One big thing is testing, widespread and regular, of all that bulk milk. Think of it like a smoke detector, but for bird flu and dairy herds. If we can spot infected farms quickly, we can keep those sick cows away from the others and stop it from spreading further.
That makes sense, catching it early. But what about us, the humans? How do we stop this thing from jumping from person to person? Becoming a full-blown pandemic. That's where protecting those farm workers comes in. They're the ones right there in the thick of it. And they deserve better. We need to make sure they have the right equipment, the right protection, and accurate information about the risks, and easy access to testing.
You mentioned equipment protection. Some of those stories we heard, it didn't sound like that was happening. That's a huge problem. Someone needs to be held accountable for that.
No question. We need transparency, and we need people to be held responsible at every level, from the farms themselves all the way up to the government agencies that are supposed to be overseeing all of this.
And what about those vaccines? If we have them, shouldn't the people who are most at risk, the ones working with these animals, shouldn't they be the first ones to get them?
A lot of experts say absolutely yes. Vaccinating the farm workers wouldn't just protect them. It could also make it less likely that the virus mutates into something that spreads more easily. It's a preventative measure, and it could have huge benefits.
More testing, better protection for the workers, maybe even vaccines. Okay, I'm following you. But is anyone actually listening? Is the government taking this seriously?
Well, there are some hopeful signs. The USDA finally said they're going to do nationwide milk testing, but a lot of people are saying it's too little, too late. And remember that new administration that's coming in? Well, let's just say their record on science and regulation, it's not exactly inspiring confidence.
Yeah, that's the other thing that had everyone on Reddit freaking out. The new president isn't exactly Mr. Pro-Science, is he? All that talk about deregulation and putting corporations first? I don't know, I'm not feeling too optimistic.
I hear ya. If they go and roll back safety regulations and cut funding for public health, like a lot of people are worried about, well, we could be setting ourselves up for a whole lot more
All right.
outbreaks, and not just bird flu. Diseases we thought we had under control, they could come roaring back.
So it sounds like we're at a crossroads here. What happens in the next few months, the decisions that get made, that could determine whether we actually start being proactive or if we just keep stumbling into these outbreaks.
That's a good way to put it. This bird flu situation, it's not just about sick birds and cows. It's a test. It's testing our systems, our priorities, our ability to deal with these new threats.
And from what we've seen so far, we're not exactly acing this test, are we? We talked about the government's response or lack of response and the challenges those farmers are facing. But let's zoom out a little. What about the whole factory farming system? That seems to be where a lot of these outbreaks start. We can't just keep putting Band-Aids on a system that's broken, can we?
That's a really important point. The way we produce meat, with all those animals crammed together in tiny spaces, it's basically the perfect breeding ground for diseases. It's not just bird flu. We've seen it with swine flu, too, and a bunch of other zoonotic diseases.
Zoonotic diseases. Can you break that down for me? I see that word everywhere, but I'm not sure I really get it.
Basically, it means a disease that can spread from animals to humans, and the more contact there is between animals and people, the more likely it is to happen.
Okay, that makes sense. So are you saying we all need to go vegan? Is that the only way to stop this?
Well, a plant-based diet is definitely a good option. It's better for the environment, that's for sure. But it's not the only solution. It's more complicated than that. We need to eat less meat overall, and we need to demand more transparency from the companies that produce our food, and support farming practices that are better for the animals and less likely to cause these outbreaks.
So less meat, better farming practices. What else is on the table? That Scientific American article mentioned lab-grown meat. I gotta admit, I'm a little skeptical. Is that stuff even for real? Will people actually eat it?
It's called lab-grown meat or cultivated meat. And yeah, it's a real thing. It's basically growing animal cells in a lab, and it creates meat that's like identical to regular meat. And yeah, people are eating it. It's getting better all the time. The taste and texture are more realistic now.
So you're saying I could have a burger that didn't come from a cow that was raised and slaughtered? That's kind of wild. But is it really a solution? Can they make enough of it? And will it be affordable?
That's the challenge, for sure. Scaling it up and making it affordable. But the industry is moving fast. There are already companies selling it. It's early days, but it has huge potential.
Okay, now I'm starting to see how this all fits together. People are more aware of the problems with factory farming, the ethical stuff, the environmental stuff. People are worried about these zoonotic diseases. And now we have this new technology that could change everything.
Exactly. It's not just about individual choices like going vegan or whatever. It's about bigger changes. We need to push for a different system. We need to demand better from our leaders and hold these corporations accountable.
So even if this bird flu thing doesn't turn into a pandemic, it's been a wake-up call, hasn't it? We can't just ignore these problems any longer.
You got it. It's a wake-up call. It's shown us the weaknesses in our healthcare system, how much influence the big industries have, how vulnerable those essential workers are. And it's forced us to face the truth about factory farming and how it's contributing to all this.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about a lot of big ideas, but I still feel a little lost. What's the most important thing our listeners should take away from this? What's the one thing they can do?
Don't lose hope. It's easy to get caught up in the bad news, the fear, the what-ifs. But we have power. We can demand better, we can make smart choices, we can create a future where pandemics like this are less likely to happen.
I like that. Action, not anxiety. But what does that look like? What can people actually do?
First of all, stay informed. Don't just believe everything you see on social media. Dig a little deeper, find good sources of information, and think critically.
Okay, so educate ourselves. What else? There's got to be more we can do besides just reading about it.
You bet. Get involved. Talk to your elected officials, push for better public health measures, support organizations that are helping those farm workers, and don't underestimate the power of your own choices.
My own choices.
Yeah.
Like going vegan, buying a hazmat suit.
Those are options, sure, but there are more everyday things you can do. Support companies that are trying to do things the right way, eat a little less meat, even if it's just one meal a week. Those little things, they add up, and they send a message.
Okay, so awareness, speaking up, taking action. It's not about waiting for someone else to fix this. It's about owning it, doing what we can to create a better future.
Exactly. It's not just about surviving this, it's about thriving. It's about using this whole mess as a chance to make things better.
And speaking of making things better, remember those weird cases in Missouri? Where they couldn't rule out human-to-human transmission? That was a scary time. But it also seemed like it woke a lot of people up.
You're right, even the people who are downplaying the risks, that case got their attention. It made them realize that this wasn't some far-off problem. It could happen to anyone, anywhere.
So maybe even if this bird flu doesn't become a pandemic, it's been a good lesson, like a fire drill for a real crisis.
Exactly. It's shown us the cracks in the system, how much power the lobbyists have, how vulnerable those workers are. And it's forced us to face the truth about factory farming and how it's connected to all of this.
Okay, so how do we move forward? We've talked about a lot of big solutions, but I still feel kind of overwhelmed. What's the one thing, the most important thing our listeners should remember?
Don't give up hope. It's easy to get stuck in all the negativity, the fear, the what-ifs. But we can do something about this. We can demand better, make good choices, create a future where these pandemics are less likely to happen.
That's a good message. It's not about accepting some awful future. It's about putting our energy into creating a better world, a world that's more resilient and more fair.
That's it, exactly. It's not just about getting through this. It's about thriving. It's about using this crisis to create real change.
And on that note, let's turn our attention to one final piece of this puzzle. It's something that could totally change how we think about food and its impact on us and the planet. All right, you've got my attention. We talked about how the bird flu is spreading, how the government's handling it, and that whole factory farming issue.
Hmm.
Now you're saying there's a game changer. Clem, spill the beans.
Okay, picture this. Juicy burgers, but without all the ethical baggage of factory farming, and no worries about getting sick from some weird virus. That's the potential of lab-grown meat. It's not science fiction anymore. It's becoming a reality.
Lab-grown meat, huh?
Yeah.
I don't know. It sounds a little too good to be true. You're saying they can grow meat in a lab, and it actually tastes like meat. What's the catch?
Well, the catch is they got to figure out how to make a lot of it, and they got to make it affordable. Making meat in a lab, it's still pretty new, but there are tons of companies putting money into this tech because people want food that's ethical and sustainable. There's a real demand for it.
That Reddit thread was wild. People either loved it or hated it. Some were calling it frankenfood, and others thought it was going to save the world. Where do you stand on this whole lab-grown meat thing?
I think it could really change the game. It could solve a lot of the problems with our food system. It's not a perfect solution, but it could make meat production way less harmful to the environment. It could be better for the animals, and it could lower the risk of those zoonotic diseases.
So it's not just about, like, the ick factor of meat from a lab. It's about the bigger picture, the environmental impact of all those farms. It's huge. Not to mention the ethical stuff.
Exactly. Think about all the land, water, and energy it takes to raise animals for food. And then there's the greenhouse gases, deforestation, pollution. Lab-grown meat, it could really cut down on all of that.
And we can't forget about how those animals are treated on factory farms. All crammed together, it's just asking for disease to spread. It's cruel.
I agree. Lab-grown meat could mean we don't need those factory farms anymore. No more ethical dilemmas.
So bringing it back to the bird flu. If lab-grown meat becomes more common, could that help prevent outbreaks like this one in the future?
Definitely. If we're not relying on these massive factory farms, there are fewer chances for those viruses to jump from animals to us. It's not just about stopping this outbreak, it's about building a food system that's stronger and less vulnerable to this kind of thing.
This is starting to feel like a real turning point. On one hand, we have this scary bird flu situation, but on the other hand, we have this amazing new technology that could change how we get our food.
You hit the nail on the head. We're at a crossroads. The decisions we make now, they're going to shape our future. We can stick with the old ways and risk more outbreaks, or we can embrace new ideas and build a better food system.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? What can they do to be a part of this change?
The first thing is to stay informed. Learn about lab-grown meat, talk about it, support the companies that are making it happen.
So education is key. Got it. What else?
Think about the choices you make, what you eat. Even cutting back on meat a little bit can make a difference. Try some plant-based options, be open to new things. The more demand there is for these sustainable, ethical foods, the faster things will change.
So it's not just about waiting for lab-grown meat to take over. It's about making good choices now that support a better food system.
That's exactly right. It's not about giving stuff up. It's about making smart choices that are good for us, good for the planet, good for everyone.
Well, this has been eye-opening, I gotta say. I'm feeling a lot more hopeful than when we started. It's easy to get caught up in all the bad stuff, but you've given us some real hope here.
That's what we're all about, giving you the information, exploring solutions, empowering you. This bird flu outbreak is scary, but it's also pushing us to innovate and make things better.
So to wrap things up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
Don't lose sight of the fact that the future of food is up to us. We get to choose a path that puts health, sustainability, and compassion first. The decisions we make today, they're going to determine the world we live in tomorrow.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought. What if this bird flu, as tough as it's been, is actually the kick in the pants we needed to create a better future? A future where our food is more resilient, more equitable, and, yeah, even more delicious. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hungry for change.